Everyone is out of the waiting room.
Terrific, thank you. And so let's get started. Welcome, everybody. This is Bettina Twerdy-Riveros. I am chair of the Vision Coalition of Delaware and Chief Public Affairs Officer and Chief Health Equity Officer at Christiana Care. Welcome, everybody, to the Equity in Education series on supporting student needs. We'll be focusing on children from low-income families, multilingual learners, students with disabilities, and others, and really thinking about critical issues today. How can public education funding best support them? So I want to thank my Vision Coalition leadership team members. You see their pictures in front of you. We have a diverse group representing school districts, charter schools, teachers, higher ed, community leaders, community-based organizations, school boards. I want to thank Secretary Holodick especially for his partnership on this work and leadership of education in our state of Delaware. So thank you so much, Secretary Holodick, and to the entire leadership team and to everybody who's participating in this work to advance education in Delaware for all the students and families we serve. We're very excited about the, you'll see here, Student Success 2025 recommendations. Many of you were involved in the development of the Student Success 2025 plan, and thank you so much. Delaware has made progress on about 60% of the recommendations in that plan. And we've frankly got a lot to be proud of. I think it's really important to always celebrate our successes and commit to continuing that success and building on that success. The plan recommends the student-centered funding system that is equitable and supports student needs. And our series has really focused on that funding system and learning about that funding system, learning about the existing system, learning what other states are doing, and now today focusing on some special student populations. We're excited about the initial steps the state has taken with opportunity funding, and we also know that we have more to achieve. In order to achieve our vision for Delaware's education funding system, there's a lot more work to be done, and we'll be talking about more of that today. So, as I mentioned, this is our third event. We've learned a lot. Let's think about what we've learned so far. In our most recent session, we learned that funding, when targeted at student needs, when we take these funds and really focus on the needs of our students, we can have a big impact on performance and long-term outcomes. That's really critical. I work in the healthcare space. We think a lot about interventions, clinical care, community supports to improve health outcomes. And here we're looking at using funding, focus on specific needs, and driving improved health outcomes and impacting student performance. We have talked about opportunity funding. I just brought that up, and how other states invest in meeting students' needs. Today, we're going to dive deeper into that. And how the states fund students based on those needs, how our system works, and what we can expect from a big report coming out later this year, the AIR report. As you see here on the slide, as I mentioned, we learned that funding can have that big impact on performance and outcomes, and that our opportunity funding presently allocates, as you see here, $616 per student, about 3 to 9% on top of average spending. It's also important, since we've learned about other states, to recognize that most other states, you'll see here, allocate, I want to double click on this, most other states allocate a weight of between 25 and 50% on top of base funding for the same student groups we'll be talking about today. So it's great to celebrate opportunity funding, and it's a great step, positive step in the right direction, and important initial step. And let's talk about and think about how we can continue to evolve, to evolve our funding system to really drive that impact on student performance and outcomes as we look at further allocations for these special needs populations. So let's, we see here themes of the AIR report. We have a big opportunity as a state, as leaders in the state, as community members, as parents, as teachers, as everybody committed and invested in improving our education system and supporting our educators and our school districts. We have a big opportunity with the independent funding assessment being released later this year. We do expect that release to be December, January, possibly a little bit earlier. We'll have to see. But we do expect it to be focused on these core principles of the funding system: adequacy of funding, equity of funding, and wealth neutrality. This session today is designed to help us understand what's coming with that report and how we can be effective advocates for change based on that report. We're looking forward to working with the Department of Education on the release of this assessment, and really appreciate Secretary Holodick's partnership and willingness to collaborate around the release of that report in order to support the community understanding, receiving that, and doing that in a way where we can really work together to get everything possible from those from the findings of that report. Now, let's see who's here today. We have a poll that's coming up. Great technology. Let's please take the poll as far as who's here today. And we're also going to see what your familiarity is with Delaware's funding system. So the first question is, who is in the room? So you can submit your response there. That will, if all tech works well, it will let us know like who we have in attendance today as far as categories of community members. And we should be getting a response. If that's delayed, we can keep going, but I'll ask the team. There we go. Who is in the room? Which category best describes your role? We have 54% educators. That's fantastic. 43% community leaders, 7% students. Great to see the students engaged and present, and 4% parents. Really fantastic. So wonderful turnout, and really grateful for everybody for being here. And I think we're going to have a poll about familiarity with Delaware's funding system, which has been the subject of the last two webinars we've had in this Equity in Education series. Those are, I'll just, while we're waiting for that, remind everybody, those were videotaped. They are available. And so if you'd like a refresher course, or if you missed them, you can access those. And now the question, how familiar are you with Delaware's school funding system? Multiple choice. Okay, and as I said, if you'd like to learn more, all right, here we go. We have, I guess the biggest cohort is 50 to 75%, with 38% of the attendees saying, checking that. And then 75 to 100% is the next box with 27%. 23% at 25 to 50, and 12% at 0 to 25. So, certainly some diversity across the respondents and the attendees today, and many with I would say, likely a solid knowledge or familiarity with the funding system. So that's terrific. I do also want to point out that there is background in the chat, the Delaware funding lawsuit and report backgrounder from the Vision Coalition Delaware. That's visioncoalitionde.org. And the link to that report is there if anyone's interested in clicking on that and saving it for review after this event. So let's go on to the next page, please. And thanks so much, everyone, Julia and everyone, for doing those polls. So as far as our agenda, I'm going to introduce our first speaker now. It's who's going to give us some context on the national landscape. Feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. Really welcome discussion, questions, and hearing what questions you all have. I'd like to introduce now Michael Griffith. He is the senior researcher and policy analyst with the Learning Policy Institute. And Mike, I'd really like to turn this over to you now to cover why we should be paying attention to investing in these high need groups. Like, why is that important? I think many of us have a decent idea around that, but would really like to hear from you and learn from your expertise. We've appreciated that you've been in Delaware before and participate in this series. But really, why should we be paying attention? Why is investment important? How do other states fund students from these groups that we're focused on today? And how does Delaware fit into the context and sort of the landscape of what that funding looks like? Then we'll ask some questions and turn to our Delaware panelists to reflect on what the opportunity funding to date has looked like and to consider the opportunity to use additional funds if equitable funding supports increased investment. So Michael, turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. If we could go to the next slide. And so one of the things we want to talk about, right, is this, we want to get everyone ready for the report that's coming out by AIR in December or January. And so you're going to see on that report a lot of information, a lot of different numbers. But what they're going to try to do is talk about how increased per pupil spending can be used positively for student achievement. So they're also going to be talking about different student groups and how each group needs their own set of funding to help them achieve their goals in education. And those goals can be, we've got listed here, test scores, but they can be things like graduation rates, college and career ready, all sorts of even attendance rates and things like that. What can funding be used for to help improve all of that? And there's some really good studies that have come out that show that if you make a long-term investment in your student population, you're going to see positive effects across the board. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And then the one after that. Great, thanks. So what the AIR report is going to come out and talk about is, what do you need for a general ed student first? And so a general ed student is a student who doesn't need additional supports in general. They aren't at risk. They aren't English language learners. They aren't special education students. And that will be a number. That's the first number they'll base everything on in their study. In other states, we call it the base amount or the foundation amount, and that's the amount needed to get a general education student up to whatever your state standards are. Then they're going to start talking about additional funding for what we just kind of call high need student groups. And that's all the groups of students, all the different students who are not general education students. So that would include at-risk students who tend to be from low-income families, English language learners. So these are the students who struggle with learning English or are new immigrants to the country, special education students, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. And then they may talk about other groups, including gifted and talented and some others. So there are the other groups are students experiencing homelessness, foster youth, and migrant students. There's a lot of good research that shows these student groups need even more funding than traditional at-risk kids, but there's no guarantee that the AIR report will specifically address these students. They may not, we're not too sure, but you might see that in the final report. So let's talk about, if we can go to the next slide, some of these groups and how states try to address them. But first off, talking about where do you all fit in on per pupil funding. So this is just a look at, if you take all your students divided by what you spend in education at the state, local, federal level, this is the average spending amount. And you can see that, you know, your comparative states, you're behind most of them. The exception is Maryland. But the thing I'd say with Maryland is this information is 2 years old at this point. Maryland just passed a big funding package that put a lot more money into schools and a lot more directed towards these high needs student groups. So we would expect to see that Maryland number surpass Delaware's number, and the next time the updated numbers come out. But it gives you an idea where you're at compared to your competitive states. If we can go to the next slide. So the biggest group that is out there that is a high need student group are what we call at risk or economically disadvantaged students. Depending on how you measure it, about a third to half of all students fit into this category. These are, you can either measure it by students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch. And if you do that, then you can see a much higher number that's about 50%. If you look at it as students who are in poverty or near poverty, it tends to be more of about a third of your student population. You can see that nationally, the vast majority of states, 45, have some form of at-risk funding that is available. There's only a small group that do not. You all do, and it was talked about a little earlier. It's about $600 per kid when you average it out. Nationally, at-risk funding tends to be about an extra $1,000 to $1,500 per kid. A lot depends on how much you spend in general for kids. So if you spend a lower amount for your general ed population, you'd have to spend a higher amount than that 1,000 to 1,500 because you're talking total dollar amount. And there's different regional cost issues there, but that gives you a general idea. It's going to be in that 1,000 to 1,500 range. We can go to the next slide. What the research has really shown, though, it gets beyond just counting the number of students you have and saying we're going to provide you a certain dollar amount per kid. The research has really shown that it's what we call a concentration factor. This idea that in in communities with a high number of low-income families, the cost per student increases. Now, you all have that in your formula. You have, once you get past 60% of your student population that is at risk, you receive a higher dollar amount. It's just that that dollar amount that you all have is lower than we would see in most of these other states that have concentration funding. But I would guess when you see the AIR study come out, you're going to see both a recommendation for higher at-risk spending, and you're going to see some form of concentration funding in there, because now the kind of tide has turned and we've got about half the states that fund this. 20 years ago when I started, or 25 years ago now, we only had 1 or 2 states that did this. So this is a real national trend that people are looking at the research and realizing they need to take up on. We could go to the next slide.
So Michael, just to be clear then, those 2 potential funding recommendations in AI could be a higher at-risk funding plus higher funding for concentrations of poverty at the school, correct?
Exactly. I would be surprised, I'll be honest with you, if we don't see both of those recommendations. Now, exactly how much is going to be, you know, kind of what AIR does, but if you look at some of the previous studies, they have recommended these things. Now, they'll also kind of dovetailing into this now, there'll also be a recommendation for English language learners. Nationally, it's about 10% of students are English language learners. The research is there to show that spending a higher amount in the beginning years to help move these students off the English language learner roles is probably the best way to spend your money, but I'm not too sure how AIR will address that. That's not something I can tell you that I can predict from the past. What the research also has shown is if a student is both at risk and an English language learner, you need to provide them additional funding for being in both groups. So if you say that if AIR comes out and says it's an additional $1,000 for English language learners, an additional $1,000 for at-risk students, then that student should get the $2,000. They should get both. Not every state does that, and not every study necessarily recommends that, but I wouldn't be surprised to see AIR recommend something like that. Because these two student groups have different sets of needs. And again, that's what the dollar amount is trying to do, is address the needs of these students. So if we go on to the next slide, here are some of the other categories they might be addressing within their study, and you might see, and it's just be ready and where I think about gifted and talented, which is in 36 states, might be within the funding recommendations. Gifted and talented has changed over the years. Back in the day when I started, gifted and talented meant students who were high IQ and struggled in school. And it was contained within special education funding. And so gifted, and you'd see a weight or a dollar amount for a gifted student, but it was a very specific student that tested for a high IQ and was struggling in school. Today, it means something very different. It means usually high achieving students. So these are the students who are doing the best in school. And most states don't know how to define that, to be honest with you. So they leave it up to the school district, and they say you can identify up to 10% of your students or something like that as gifted and talented, and we'll give you an extra dollar amount per kid. The research really isn't there to show that gifted and talented kids need more money. They need different classes sometimes or different supports, but not different funding levels. So it might be in the AIR report, but I would sort of be surprised if it was. Gifted and talented tends to be left out of these types of studies.
And Mike, just to follow up on that, then, for those students that used to be funded who have high IQ and are struggling, are there any sources of funding for that cohort of students at this time?
Usually not. Those kids would either be put within at risk, or if they had a high IQ and say some other attention deficit disorder, they might be identified within that group, and so they get special ed funding from a different stream. But in a lot of ways, that group has been kind of left out, or they kind of get lumped in with the high achieving students, because some of those kids are high achieving. Also, I should say this, we've got a group of students that are both high achieving and special ed, but they're in, autistic student might really excel at math, but struggle with English studies and reading and writing. And so in some states, you can see a kid getting funded for gifted, but also for special education. And so we've seen that in some states. I should say, on the special ed realm, the group that has seen the largest increase are kids on the autism spectrum. And those kids have a lot of different sets of needs, and they can fit into a lot of different categories. And so they tend to be addressed within special education, but occasionally they're addressed within gifted and talented.
Thank you.
Students experiencing homelessness, there's more research coming out, and this is sort of self-serving because my organization has put out a lot of this, but we're seeing now that the gap between students experiencing homelessness and traditional at-risk kids is as big as the learning gap between at-risk kids and general ed kids. So this is a group that really struggles and needs additional supports, not just in the classroom, but around the classroom. So what we traditionally call wraparound services. 5 states now have identified this and supply extra funding. We've also got research out there that now shows foster youth children are much closer to, say, homeless students and the supports they need. Same with migrant students. And with these 3 groups, students experiencing homelessness, foster youth, and migrants, what the research shows that is if a student attends 2 or more schools within a school year, they have a very low probability of achieving their educational goals that year. So it might be that AIR addresses this within their study. I would hope so, but it's about 50-50. But you might see something like this about highly mobile students trying to address all 3 of these. So And then if you could go to the next slide.
And,
Oh.
and when you have a chance, there is a question from Darrell Green. What are the 5 states that have special programs around addressing homelessness? I did want to kind of double click on that homelessness issue, and as we if you could respond to Darrell's question, and then 2, perhaps in the discussion we can hear from others around the burden and frankly, the tragedy of homelessness among students, and what that population looks like in their schools for the educators among us. But could you respond to Darrell's question if you have that information, or
Sure.
perhaps follow?
So I can tell you, California just recently put a good amount of money into funding programs for students experiencing homelessness. Washington State has done the same. States like New York have provided additional funding for transportation, because part of the McKinney-Vento Federal Act requires school districts to supply transportation to students who are experiencing homelessness to wherever their home school is, or the school that they started the school year out. But the research has really shown that doesn't happen, even though they're supposed to be doing that. So some states have stepped forward and said, we're going to provide extra transportation funding to ensure that that happens for kids. And Stephanie, one of my coworkers, has just posted, we have a paper and you can look at each of the states and we have more details. I know there are 2 other states and I cannot remember what they are right now, so I don't want to just make something up for you. But yeah, it is there are some states too, and this is that have supplied special funding for students experiencing homelessness, and then it only lasts for a year or 2. And quite frankly, with any of these funds, we talk about, if it's for any of these groups, it needs to be consistent. It needs to be a high enough level to provide the impact, but it needs to be within the funding system so that it can be predictable for school districts and schools to know that they can supply these services. And that's true for students experiencing homelessness, but also for at-risk, ELL, any of these groups.
Thanks so much. And I'll note Kirsten Olson's comment here, noting that they've long observed that students who are highly mobile have struggled, and even when they get transportation, which is wonderful, Kirsten, some of the students experience very long commutes, and that's really difficult and really challenging for students and families. And I'm sure tracking that funding and where it should go is probably also challenging as well. So certainly a component of a challenging issue for that population as well. So now that you've told us about some of the other states, including some of these other categories of high needs students, what can we expect in the independent assessment of Delaware's funding system? I think it'd be good for us to think about what should we be paying attention to and prioritizing, which targeted groups we expect to get more funding, and how it should be spent. So maybe you could start off with what you think we can expect from the report.
So it's going to, again, if sticking with what AIR has done in the past and other organizations that have done these kind of studies, which I've been part of these studies in different states, it's going to probably recommend that you change your funding system as a whole, that you think about it as a funding system that is not sort of allocating positions, which the current Delaware system does, but targets funds to specific students and their needs. That's the generally accepted formula now. It's called the foundation formula. So it will produce a number for a general ed kid, like I said, and then a list of additional funding for each one of these student groups. I'll also say, just because AIR recommends something doesn't mean it's going to become law. In fact, it rarely happens that way, but at least that's sort of the start of the conversation. Now, say if there's a group that you want to support or you think should be included, let's say students experiencing homelessness, you can make sure to advocate that from the beginning, right? That we like AIR's report, but we feel these other groups need to be included also. The other thing is they're going to sort of talk about, with each of these groups, probably some recommended funding activities. So in some cases, there'll be freedom to spend how you spend. In other cases, they'll talk about this money should be used or probably should be used for smaller class sizes for certain groups, for certain programs, maybe like summer school and after school, or pull-out programs during the day. It's going to depend on kind of how they see things and how they conduct this study. So in some cases, in some of these studies, they'll simply say, here's the money, and this is what you need, and it's up to the school districts how to spend it. And others, there'll be essentially strings attached where they'll say, we recommend this money, but it should be used. Everyone should have a summer learning program. Everyone should have a after-school program. So that's one of the things to look for in this study, like what are the recommended dollar amounts, but then what are the recommended activities or even mandated activities to pay attention to? And then the question is this money going within the primary formula, or are they going to have separate pockets of funding? It's always, knowing AIR, they'll probably all want it in a single formula. So that's great in some ways. It makes sure, for instance, that the at-risk funding is contained and kind of protected in the formula and not an outside portion. The negative is it's not always clear once you get this money that it is being spent on the kids it's supposed to be spent on. So what you will get in that kind of formula is a big check that says your school district is entitled to this much money from the state, but it's hard to kind of figure out how much of that money comes from, it should be targeted to at-risk kids or English language learners or special ed. So you want some protections for those kids. So if the state is providing your school district, $3 million for at-risk kids, you'd really want to make sure somehow that $3 million is being spent on those at-risk kids. And that's not always the case with these. And I know that's a bit confusing sounding because you say, well, we got the 3 million because we have this many at-risk kids. Shouldn't we be spending that? Well, if it's not there in the recommendations, then it could be something where the money goes to the school district, but doesn't go to the kids it should go to.
Okay. And the way you explain that, then you anticipate, though, that the formula would change from positions to funding per students based on baseline, general ed, special needs, concentrated populations. And that, so it would be a, frankly, new formula, right? Correct? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that really is kind of the way it's been going for a couple decades now, is that these studies recommend what we call a foundation formula, which is a formula targeted towards kids and their needs, as opposed to a position allocation system like you all have in Delaware. And I think I've talked about this in one other presentation I made to this group, but there are about 6 states that have your type of funding formula. And it's been shrinking every kind of decade. There used to be probably 15 or so states that did this, and it's just changed over the years. The vast majority of states, probably in the around 40, use some kind of foundation formula or base formula that provides a dollar amount for general ed kids and then some additional funding for all these extra student groups. There also tends to be adjustments for other things. And I don't want to get too complicated here because I know some of the people were, when they kind of answered about what they know about formulas, but there are some of these other underlying things. And one of them, for instance, is essentially a cost of doing business adjustment. So they'll make adjustments in your state for those places where it's more expensive to do business. That kind of adjustment, which is sort of hard to explain and hard to talk about, can make a huge difference from district to district. So there are some of these things that, like, highlighting and trying to get to know, to understand why there might be such a difference in funding from one district to the next when this study comes out. Because what it should do is it should, in the beginning, talk about what is recommended for your state funding wise. Then it should show you what the total cost is of these recommendations. And then finally, it should show what each district would receive funding wise under this new formula. I mean, that's an absolute minimum, all the things I talked about. So you can see what you all would get district by district under this new formula. You can then stack that against what you're currently getting to see the difference between the current formula and the new formula. And I think that's very important to let people understand how that's working. Because some of these things can sound great. For instance, the cost of doing business sounds like a great adjustment. But what it tends to do is it moves money from lower wealth areas in your state to higher wealth areas. Because where is it more expensive to do business? Higher wealth areas. And I can tell you in my home state of Colorado, when they put this formula in, people didn't really realize what a change it would make. And it moved a lot of money from low wealth places to school districts like Aspen and Vail. And anything that's good for the Aspen school district is probably not a great idea for everybody else. That's one of the wealthiest places in America. And if you're pumping more money in there, that's not great. So it's just things like this to be aware of. But I will say I'm giving all these cautionary notes. I think this study will be great. I think it's going to offer you a lot of ideas and alternatives. I think it's going to be able to update your formula. So I think it's a really good thing. There's just things to be aware of when it comes out.
So I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. I do have one. You mentioned an ability to compare. So to think about as a school, the position allocation formula gives us X, and the foundation formula, potentially with a cost of doing business adjustment, would give us Y. And doing, like, are you saying that there'll be the ability to make that comparison, that that will be available, or that will be included in the report, or is that something further down the road? Do you have a sense of that? Or have you had
it should usually be included in the report. One of the hesitancies is if you're doing a study like this in a state with a lot of districts, it might be too much to put in the report, so they'll put a couple examples. But your state has a small number of districts, so that should be included. And what they'll usually do is say, under the last year of the old formula, so they'll look at the 2023-24 funding for each of your school districts in Delaware, and they'll say you got this much money. Then they'll say, under our proposal, with the new funding and the new formula, this is how much you'd all get. And so you can kind of take a look at that. If that isn't done, you can put that together fairly quickly. Then they should at least have what would the expectation if you implemented all of our recommendations, this is what the districts would get. They might not compare it to the old funding, but you can do that pretty quickly to get an understanding. So it should be in there somewhere, usually in the end at the appendix.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So if we could advance to the next slide. And again, if people have questions, please add them in the chat. I would like to ask my fellow Vision Coalition leadership team members to introduce themselves and speak to their experience. Darrell and Margie, I know that your district and charter schools have received opportunity funding. So maybe introduce yourselves, and then could you speak to how you've leveraged those funds and what difference you see it making? So would really appreciate that. Margie, why don't you start off?
Sure. I am a founding member and the CEO of Las Americas Aspira Academy, Aspira, Delaware. And we're a dual language immersion charter school, and we serve students kindergarten through 12th grade with a large population of low income, a large population of English learners, and a large population of special education students.
And good afternoon, everyone. Darrell Green, Superintendent of the Red Clay Consolidated School District. We are, again, the largest, most comprehensive school district in the state of Delaware. We have about 27 schools and or programs receiving opportunity funding. We're a district that has a formal population of about 26% or so students that identify as low income, on 17% students with disabilities, and roughly about 15% of our student demographic or population are identified as multilingual learners. With an additional, and this is using last year's September 30th count data as we certify this year's, about 2% of our students were identified as homeless or experiencing homelessness, but we know those numbers, as our national expert indicated, are much larger than, I think what the formal percentages of students who we serve are identified through our unit count.
Great, thanks, Darrell. What was the percentage of multi-language learners?
last year, based on our September 30th count, was roughly about 15%.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Margie, do you want to start off? How have you leveraged opportunity funds for the populations you've identified? And you two can obviously go back and forth, share some of your thoughts about how you've used those funds, what difference you see it making, and if you had resources like we've seen in other states, what would that impact be?
Sure. So we used our funding for staffing. We were able to hire a biliteracy instructional coach, and that person supports our teachers in helping them understand how to build biliteracy in the classroom in English and in Spanish. Our ELL population is about 40%. Obviously, we have a smaller population than Red Clay, but definitely a higher concentration of English learners because of the fact that we're a dual language immersion school. We tend to have people refer students to our school because of that setting. The other thing we did with the funding is hire another English learner teacher who specifically works with the students, but really focusing on supporting both languages, building and developing their first language, Spanish, while also developing their English language proficiency. And the third part of the funding was used for a culture and climate specialist, which was really for our low-income students as well as our EL students, really helping to help them navigate the new, the education system, which can definitely be very challenging when it comes to the language piece, the language barriers, but also the economic piece of it, and helping them to sort of navigate that by supporting their social emotional needs. And difference that it's made is that we feel that our students feel more valued. We embrace and we celebrate their culture and their language. So our goal is not for them to solely learn English, but we want them to continue to be proficient in their first language. The message is that you don't need to let go of your past. You don't need to let go of your culture. You don't need to let go of your language in order to assimilate here in the United States. The teachers have a better understanding of what language acquisition looks like, right? So, we don't learn language through osmosis. It doesn't just seep into our skin. There's a process, there's strategies that teachers can utilize in the classroom, just like they do with special education students to support those students that are struggling with the language. Because if we don't do that, they just fall further behind in the content knowledge, and then they lose hope. And when they lose hope, that's when we start losing students and they start dropping out. And as a school, we've been able to expand.
Great, thanks so much, Margie.
Sorry, Bettina.
Really, really interesting there, especially culture. No, did I interrupt you? I'm sorry.
That's all right, go ahead.
No, you maybe you froze. You stopped there for me. So apologies if I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. I'll wrap up. You gave us a 3-part question, so I'll give you the second part, which really, as a school, is being able to expand our Family Resource Center. It's not just supporting the child, but it's supporting the family and making sure that we address things like literacy among the adults in the family, as well as any food and home insecurities in the family. So that's another big part of what we've been able to see from the additional funding. And I'll hand it over to Darrell.
Yeah, and I won't belabor. And similar to Aspida and what Margie indicated, we've looked at differentiated needs across our individual schools, obviously, that receive opportunity funding. As I indicated, we have 27 schools. If you include programs like the Meadowwood program, my First Day School, which is located in Wilmington Hospital, providing different services, everything from hiring additional English EL teachers, licensed clinical social workers, school psychs, counseling and reading supports. And so it's differentiated, again, based on specific needs of our individual schools, and working with our schools and building level teams to ultimately determine how those resources are best utilized within a given school setting. So, again, everything from reading supports and really looking at targeting our English language learners, because that is a growing population. Again, when we have 15% on record, and then really looking at additional students and families who would need that additional support is kind of where our target focus area has been.
Thank you. So some really good work happening with the opportunity funding that we have to date, and that's important and a great investment and commitment by our state. Could you speak to, most other states allocate a weight of between 25 to 50% on top of the base funding, and we're at 3 to 9. Again, a good start. Like, this is perhaps an evolution. Could you speak to impact, like what you do with those additional resources as we've seen in other states, and how you would recommend it be allocated? Jarrell, you want to start off?
Yeah, I think that, again, the flexibility of really helping school communities work to identify what that need is. We have the flexibility, again, to determine whether it's reading supports or EL supports, whether we need a licensed clinical social worker. So we've seen wraparound services and things get put in place as it relates to the additional funding. I think really looking at the broader need, as much as we talk about, and again, Michael indicated that, a third to half of the student population would identify as economically disadvantaged. Something that I want to put out there is, we have a lot of families who fall into this category, and the acronym is called ALICE, which is asset limited, income constrained, yet employed families. So we have a lot of families who are paycheck away from being in poverty, right? And so how do our schools and how do we know ultimately what the needs of our school communities are, and how we can use this flexible funding to really generate and support that need? We're seeing a post-COVID, a huge number of families who are multiple occupancy families who may not necessarily be designated as homeless, but multiple families living in certain households. And so when you have a licensed clinical social worker and those needs avail themselves in real time, how are we able as a system to be able to adjust and direct that funding specific to it? And again, Michael indicated, certain states are looking at if you are a multilingual learner, as well as an economic disadvantage or low income family. How can you use that funding to be a force multiplier to really address those broader needs that students and families who fall within those particular subgroups have access to that funding? And so we've seen some benefit, schools like Forest Oak, for example, who and Red Clay, who've done some amazing work, really working and supporting our English learners, really looking at small group instruction, those various assets using our EL teachers, and seeing some gains in that regard. And it's just as much as the funding is important as how do we actually align and put the systems in place to maximize the use of that funding is equally as important. So we definitely appreciate the funding. We can always use more. We'll never turn it away. But really being strategic and intentional about, making sure, again, that the funding as it's been designated, supports our multilingual learners, supports students who are economically disadvantaged or low income, that we're making sure that that funding goes to what the exact needs are, and being able to address and have systems in place to deal with real life issues that happen in real time, right? And so I think it's been important to be able to use those fundings to be intentional about putting those supports and systems in place.
So having flexibility around those support systems to react in real time to some of those needs, I guess, is one thing I heard. Another thing I heard is you talked about the force multiplier effect. Then you would recommend, as far as how things would be allocated, that you'd be able to stack those funds if you got additional funds for someone who is an English language learner, someone who is like economically disadvantaged, et cetera. Is that right?
Yeah, and for us looking at communities, we don't have static feeder patterns. And so I'll use a school like AI Middle, for example, where those students go to 3 different traditional high schools. And so ultimately, how do we look at the communities in which our students and families come from, and how we can actually use that funding more broadly to address a lot of the holistic needs that we know are coming into our schools. And that's how we're looking at it as a district. How can we align and ensure continuation of services through our elementary schools that receive opportunity funding to the feeder middle schools, and really look at it from a systems approach, so that we're not providing early intervention at the K-5 level, and then they get to 6-12 and those supports, fall off. And, we have a lot of families who, the benefits cliff is a real issue. When you talk about, purchase of care, and those are the funding mechanisms that support families, once you get to that 12 to 13-year age in middle school, a lot of those supports and services fall off. So we have to be intentional about the whole picture and the whole pie, and then ultimately how we can really strategically use the opportunity funds to not just fill the gaps, but look at sustainability of supports and services that we use the funding for.
And that would include systems to make sure they track the students wherever they go, right?
Correct. Yep.
Terrific. Margie?
So I'll echo a lot of what Darrell said. As far as like social workers would be definitely something that we would want the extra funding for. Really, and also having all of our educators become ESL certified. It's a 5-course process, and right now teachers have to pay out of pocket in order to complete those courses. They're not attached to a master's program, so they don't get compensated at the end for taking those courses. So I think that's a big part of just learning how language acquisition works and having our teachers have that certification. Being able to offer after school programming, but not just the program, but also the free childcare and the transportation that goes along with it in order to just expand and increase the instructional time. The other thing is, our special education population is just shy of 20%, but our EL population is about 40%. So twice as many students identified as ELL. And over the years, we've been able to hire a special education teacher for every grade level. We've not been able to do close to that on the EL side. So the extra funding would definitely help us to hire those additional teachers to support and be able to focus on a grade level so that their caseload is not so large where they lose effectiveness. And then the other thing I found it interesting in Michael's presentation when he showed the other states, I saw that some of the states offer free meals to students, right? That's a big burden off of our families. And when you talk about serving a large EL population, that's a group of individuals that are not going to government agencies for food stamps and for welfare. And right now our system automatically identifies families and students that qualify for free meals at school based on whether their family is receiving government assistance. And because these families are not seeking out that assistance, they then don't show up on the radar. So during COVID, when we were able to provide free meals to all of our students, that was amazing. And that's something that I would love for our state to implement across the board.
So that could be one way, flexibility that would support using the funds for that, or even achieve it a different way by the state, right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Perfect. And I invite others who are on the call, if you have ideas on how additional funding could be utilized if it were available to drive impact and to improve outcomes for those student populations, or any comments about the different student populations or how the funds should be allocated. Other groups beyond those that we initially identified, which were the at-risk, ELL, special ed, and gifted and talented, which was sort of unclear whether they would be included. But if they're the other groups that we talked about, mobile, migrant, homeless, et cetera, if you have thoughts or opinions around states supporting or allocating additional funds to those groups, please share that in the chat, or continue to be engaged as we go forward in this work. Now I think we should go on to the next slide and take a look statewide at where the opportunity funds were spent. This slide is a reminder, I mentioned it earlier, that Delaware is funding only 3% more high need, 3% more per high need student. Again, a good start. And we've heard from Darrell and Margie, some of the great work and great utilization of those funds for social workers, for various supports ELL teachers, a culture and climate navigator, other things like that. But we only have 2 of those groups that Mike talked about included so far in as low income and multilingual learners in the current opportunity funding. So if we go on to the next slide, district leaders, if we think about the recent investments and district leaders sharing that how they spent these funds. And you can see here that most was spent on increasing staffing, scaling up some pilot programs, and since we've got ongoing funding. So you can take a look here at 64% staffing, 14% some other investments, out of school programming and instructional materials at 10 to 12%. So the majority was staffing and instructional materials and out of school programming. Mike, how does this, when you look at these investments, how does this compare to what you see nationally when school districts and schools are given more funding?
So I really can't address that. I will say when we've seen these studies come out and then they change the funding formula, what you see is the money goes into staffing, and it makes sense. And nationally, teacher salaries and benefits are about 60% of education spending. There's another 20% that goes into all other staffing positions. So that would be anywhere from, the superintendent to the people who work in the cafeteria, but it would also include counselors and social workers and psychologists. And so you see this when the money comes in, that's the move that tends to be made, is it goes into these staffing positions. The other thing with staffing that parents want, and the research is sort of split on, is parents want smaller class sizes. So that's one of the first things they'll ask when new money comes in is, why didn't my son or daughter's class size shrink? Some of the research is out there that shows your money actually might be better spent on social workers and counselors for kids, or for pull-out programs, or for some other things. But I will say that's one of the first things we tend to hear from parents. That's the result they understand. That's what they get with their kid. They also understand new programs. And so they will say, this money came in and I wanted my son or daughter to have a summer learning experience. And why isn't that happening? So that's something else to think about. When and if you get the new money, it's thinking about not just how to spend it, but how do you explain it to the public and why you made some of these choices. I think a lot of times you see in other states that they did make these choices based on their research, based on what their needs were, but maybe didn't explain them as well as they could have to parents. So I think that's out there. Things like instructional material and other, so we hear a lot about this. Instructional material, you can have these savings, you can do this and that, equipment, technology. Those things equate for something like less than 10%, all of it put together. Transportation is about 10%. So, it's one of these things, again, this is something that people tend to focus in on, but letting them know why you spent the money, where it's going, and what benefits are additional benefits are being provided to their students within a school, I think is really helpful. Again, some of these studies will say, we think you should target the money and spend it specifically on this, this, and this. I would always push back on that, because kind of the research also shows that these decisions are best made at the district level, where there are a lot of differences. And so we've seen sometimes where states come in and put a lot of additional money in, but mandate that it goes into certain areas. And sometimes those areas work for school districts and sometimes they don't. And there was an example of a state that saw a reading program that really worked and helped kids in a couple of districts. So they mandated every school district use their new money for a reading program, and it didn't have the results. And it's because their student populations didn't necessarily need that. They might have needed it for a math program, or from specific counseling for specific student groups. And those districts ended up getting kind of hit because of that, because the state said, look, we gave you more money and you're not showing any student improvement. And, the districts pushed back and said, yes, you gave us more money, but we couldn't do with it what we wanted to. So sorry, long-winded answer for there's a lot going on. But it is important to think about though, because we talk an awful lot about the revenue side, but not as much about the expenditure side.
Well, it's really important to hear that that experience of some other places around when they don't have the flexibility to at the local level, at the local school district level, to determine how best to utilize those funds, school district charter, et cetera. As I look at Margie and Darrell here. So, but can you speak to what you expect as far as Delaware's opportunities, or what we could expect coming out of this report, given where we are with opportunity funding right now? And what perhaps when we consider funding for these populations, like what may we expect? Could you speak to that a little bit more, please?
Again, sort of playing off on what they've done in previous studies and what's been done in these studies around the country, I would say you'd see a higher base number amount for all kids. Then you would see a increased investment for what you all call opportunity funds. And it probably would be split, and they would have two separate funding pockets, one for at-risk students and one for English language learners. Now the question is, would they allow for funding for both student groups? That's kind of split on these studies. It isn't 100%. Most of the newer studies tend to say, yes, you should get both of those because the research shows that. But I couldn't tell you for sure with AIR. I would say that they might identify the services that this funding could be spent on, but I would be a little surprised if they mandated spending on certain areas. That tends not to be how they do things. They tend to be more, they might talk about the way they figured out the additional costs. So they might say, we looked at what are the services that kids need. And they traditionally need these types of services, and these types of services will cost so much per kid. And that's our recommendation for spending. It doesn't mean that they're saying those are the services you should get. It's just that's how they cost these things out. So yeah, I would say more money, more freedom, and is the most likely way to go with these.
Would you anticipate that would mainly be for those two categories? And could you speak to what you expect as far as special ed, homeless, gifted and talented, any of those others? Does that really depend on rather not so much on the report, but on those getting further input from the public on those other categories? Post report, or what do you expect from the report with respect to other categories of students?
Gifted and talented will be in there. That is the largest kind of driver of all these high need groups. The question of how they do that is going to be, kind of all over the map. I would expect at a minimum that they would have 3 different groups for special education: mild, then moderate, severe, and then students would be placed into each group. The trend nationally is that there are even more groups than that. You don't just keep it to 3, but there'd be at least 3 that I would expect, and then they would recommend different funding levels. Someone asked in there a question that I thought was really good in the chat, which was, who watches states to make sure that they're spending the money on these kids? And there isn't much federal oversight on this. There is in special ed. Special ed districts are required to provide students with the services that they need within their individual education plan, and regardless sort of the cost. So it's up to school districts to pay for that. Now they receive some state funding and some federal funding to help them with that. But across the board, when you talk to school districts, they'll say the state money and the federal money is not enough. And very often we'll have to dip into our general ed fund to help pay for these costs. So I would expect that for the AIR report, you would see increased special ed funding, which would not mean, and I know again, this is one of these confusing things, it would not mean necessarily more services for special ed kids because they're getting the services that are required. It would take the pressure off your general ed budget as a school district. So you wouldn't have to move that money over to help special ed kids. then I would expect to see, again, you'd have an at-risk funding there and ELL. I would be shocked if special ed, at-risk, and ELL weren't all fully addressed in this. Gifted and talented may or may not be addressed, and that's going to depend if the state asked for it to be addressed. If it did not, then it probably will not be included.
Okay.
And the other groups are the same way, unfortunately. I think if the state asked for these to be included, they would be, otherwise they wouldn't be.
That would be homeless, foster, and migrant mobile students.
Correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. And I want to thank Dr. Johnson Pierce for that question. Excellent question. Sorry, I missed it in the chat. Thanks for
No worries. Thank you.
So, okay, so very very exciting to learn more about what we can expect in that report. In this discussion, a question came up, or maybe a comment by you, Mike, about communicating to the public, to students, to families about what additional funds are being used for and the importance of that communication. So I just want to note that and invite any comments from others. That communication strategy will be key. I don't know, as far as I'm looking at the Vision Coalition leadership team and our amazing staff to really put a pin in that issue as we think about what that looks like going forward as far as communication around this AIL report, and then also moving forward. And maybe that's primarily a Department of Education and charter school and school responsibility around communicating with additional funds. Here are the things that we're doing. Here's the impact that we're having. I think that's a really important call out that you made, Mike. Okay, so moving on to, I'm looking at, there's perhaps a couple more questions in the chat. We've long observed, oh no, that was from Kirsten. When you say at-risk students, does that include the ACEs students, adverse childhood experiences? Or is that at risk based on economics?
It's at risk based on economics, although some states will have both an economics measure and an other measure that might include those students. And so they'll say you're either qualify under the economics guidelines or you qualify under some other educational guidelines. And I'd say, I mean, I couldn't tell you for sure, but I'd say about maybe 25% of the states have some additional thing beyond just the economic guidelines.
Would we expect there'd be recommendations in the report about the breadth of that definition to include other categories such as ACEs, or would that be something that would be left up to the state?
It could. It will be interesting though, and this is something Darrell brought up, and it's very, and again, I hate to do technical stuff, but how do you define at risk? Because if you define it simply as students in poverty, you're going to miss a lot of the kids that we would call the working poor, like Darrell said. And that's a pretty big group. And we have seen some states, because of this thing called community eligibility, where you can say every student within, if you have a certain percentage of students who qualify for low income, you can count all your students for low income for free and reduced price lunch purposes. So you can qualify that under the federal government.
Right.
So we've seen states change the way they do these counts, and the states that have moved over to the counts where it simply is identifying those students who qualify for certain government programs, they miss those students who are the working poor. So that definition is going to be very important, and that's the difference of sort of identifying a third of your kids or identifying half your kids as being at risk. The other is they may include, although I would probably doubt it, other educational measures, like, is a student failing, and in some cases they identify, in some states like Texas, as military students. Students of military families would automatically be included as at risk. Students who are pregnant or have been pregnant within the last year, or different other sort of measures. But more and more, it is just an economic measure, and that's what I would expect them to stick with.
That's what you'd expect from the report. It
Yeah.
sounds like it all comes down to the definition, as so many things do. The power is in the pen as you craft any implementation of this. There's a question for you in the chat. Are there trends about what superintendents like or dislike about foundation formulas? This is from Paul Herdman. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. That's like a very difficult question, but let me see if I can. States that have a foundation formula don't want any strings to be attached to it. The superintendents like it when they have control over it, if they already have a foundation formula. I'll be honest though, in states like yours that have a position allocation system, superintendents tend to like that in some ways because it mandates where they can spend. And so that in some ways frees up their time for budgeting because they say, look, I can't move money from A to B because the budget's already structured this way. And I shouldn't say everyone, but it's more sort of 50-50 with superintendents. Some superintendents who are in a position allocation system really kind of like it, and some absolutely hate it. So the ones who hate it want greater freedom and they're open to a foundation system. Those who like it are nervous about moving away towards a system where now they have to make a ton of choices. And so what I would say is the states that have done this have been able to do it in transition from one system to the next. And what you tend to see is not a lot of difference in budgeting in the first year or two. It's when you get to years 3, 4, and 5 that superintendents are willing and school business officials are willing to take more chances, are willing to be more open with their budgeting and start looking at different ways of doing it. So I wouldn't expect to see, if you did move to a foundation formula, any big change in your state in the first or second year. It's when you start getting beyond that, when people are more accepting of the freedom, you kind of move on from there.
Thank
But
you.
once you get that, you don't move back. Like no one has moved back from a foundation formula to a more restrictive one, because once you have the freedom, you like it.
Great, thank you. Any comments from Darrell, Margie on those on that response, or on the question, or anything else, frankly?
No, I would just generally say in terms of, you definitely want some level of freedom and autonomy as it relates to funding. I think there are some positive aspects to the unit count just in terms of building a sustainability in the system, because you know what your basic needs are going to be going into year over year, but you ultimately want to be able to have some type of flexibility and again addressing those things that come up in terms of staffing. Excuse me. As of right now, we do our unit count. Families, students continue to enroll. There's a lot of mobility within a lot of our schools, and sometimes the unit count kind of locks you in, where you do need that additional flexibility. Let's say to reduce the class size. Part of that issue ultimately is, do you have the space? That's a lot of our challenge. A lot of times when you're kind of locked into, you've built your classes out, you don't want to put staff art on a cart, for example, or take different resources away from other staff. But that typically is the challenge when you look at reducing or reduction of class sizes. A lot of times our facilities are landlocked and we just generally don't have the adequate space to be able to add it. And who wants to be the family in a trailer?
Right. All right. Well, thank you, Darrell. Any final last words, Margie? Are you good?
No, I'll just echo. I believe that local control is definitely the way to go. I think the two things that I would hope that the state would consider is the meal program and funding that, as well as fully funding transportation. So right now, when you talk about being able to provide these after school opportunities, transportation always comes up. And as a charter school, we don't get 100% of the transportation funding. Neither does the vocational schools. So that's another big barrier.
And particularly just on that last point around, again, not to belabor, with the community eligibility, the CEP program. I mean, that is based on, TANF, which is the temporary assistance for needy families, and or SNAP. So, and that's kind of USDA kind of governed. I know, during COVID, they were flexible in our ability to feed everyone. But to Margie's point, just because you may live in what is deemed to be a affluent zip code or, doesn't mean that there is a need. And that's one of the things why we're pulling in a lot more demographic data into our schools that are ultimately seen as not, the perception is that they don't have a need. I think one of the things that we saw during COVID, especially through the feeding program, was that there's need across our district, regardless of your zip code or the community that you live in. So again, I would really encourage everyone to get familiar with ALICE, which is Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. Again, those are the families who are truly living paycheck to paycheck. And that's a large percentage of Delaware families who are in that position.
Thank you. That's critically important. I know in the healthcare space, we see food, frankly, food insecurity, hunger, frankly, is a core issue. And a lot of we invest community benefit dollars in programs to support our patients' access.
That impacts childcare. That impacts your ability to put your child in an after-school enrichment program. That there's a whole host of things that families are making decisions about that then puts a burden, and I don't want to say a burden, but puts added pressure for schools to add additional resources to support schools, families, and the community.
Right. Thank you. And thank you for sharing around ALICE. Really important to look at that, looking beyond SNAP and TANF. And as you noted, Margie, some families who aren't accessing those, you'd want to get a full school access to the feeding meal programs and transportation and other things. Any further comments, questions people want to put in the chat? Anything else you'd like to hear from Mike or from Darrell or Margie or any of us? We are here to answer your questions. I encourage all of you to stay really engaged on this front. Look forward to seeing the AIR report when it comes out. Please reach out to the Vision Coalition of Delaware for any support or to take a look at the prior webinars that we did in the equity and education funding arena. Really great there. I think I'm going to go back and listen because I was there, but it would be worthwhile just to hear it again. And please engage around as we look at our other work of the Vision Coalition and education leaders across the state as we look at continuing to plan for the vision for education even into the future. So there'll be some things coming out around that. Would like you to participate in, give us your input on around those aspirations for the future. So on this front, I really want to thank everyone for joining. The recording of this session today will be sent to the Vision Coalition email list. It will be posted on the website. Please forgive me for any misstatements. And stay tuned for upcoming events, including a release of that independent assessment. Apparently there's a national alert going on, a test of the National Wireless Emergency Testing Program. So apologies for that noise, but
we all got it, Bettina.
Got it, right? So I'm not the only one. Good to know.
Happens every 3 years.
Oh, thank you. Good to know. I've learned something. So stay tuned for upcoming events. Look out for that release. Please make sure that you're engaging as the Vision Coalition reaches out for further participation and input. And really grateful for everyone participating. Really terrific. And I'm so grateful to all of you. Thank you.